absolutely thrilled to be here and introducing these amazing women. The first person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Kim Coopers, who attained her PhD from Maastricht, where she is now an associate professor in the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience. Kim and her team aim to understand the neurobiological mechanisms which underpin empathy, flexible cognition, and well-being by studying the effects of psychedelics, as well as the motivations and patterns of psychedelic use. So over to you, Kim.
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction, and also Joe for inviting me to this spectacular event. I'm going to try to share my screen now, because what are we without our PowerPoints? I'm going to try to, where are my icons? Everything pops up. Where can I start this thing? Is it here? If somebody can help me, because I don't see my button in the, here it is, okay. So, I hope that everybody can hear me well. I was introduced as somebody from the Netherlands. I work in the Netherlands, and this is actually the building where I work. But since a year now, I've been working like, I think, most people from home, and that is Belgium for me. So it's the country next to the Netherlands. I'm going to, everybody received 10 minutes, and for me, it's always difficult to stay in time. I've reduced my presentation considerably, and I hope that I can deliver what you expected to hear from me. I want to tell you something about what we did in the lab and what applications or implications it can have for therapy. So I like to start with presenting my vision on this, because now psychiatry is with the conventional treatments, but in the future, I hope within 10 years, we will have a revised psychiatric board, a revised psychiatric hospital. It will not be in hospital anymore, but anyway, this is my hospital with 4 windows representing the 4 classes in psychedelic medicine. So the first class, and that is the class I'm going to talk about, are the classical psychedelics with psilocybin and LSD as prototypical examples. You also have the empathogens with MDMA as prototypical example, the associatives with ketamine, and the unique substances of which cannabis is an example. And I designed this hospital, I think 1 or 2 years ago, and a couple of months ago, I realized that I had to rebuild my hospital. And I added another window, and that is the window of the non-hallucinogenic novel psychoactive substances. And I've had discussions with people over this. I think the best person to be linked to this class is David Olson. He is investigating analogs of psychedelics that work in the same way at a biological level, but do not have the psychedelic effects. And why did I have these discussions with people? They say, well, we have been fighting for years to be able to use these substances with psychedelic effects, and now we want to give analogs without these effects. So, but I do think they deserve a place in the hospital, because there will be instances where you need to give something without these effects if preparation is not possible in case of an emergency. Or I've shown you here an article at the bottom. In case of ibogaine, it is a substance with potential, but it has also a toxicity. So if you could have the positive effects without the toxicity, that would be wonderful. But I'm not going to talk about novel psychoactive substances. What I want to say is, how can we understand psychedelic medicine's power? So in my view, you have a lot of sources. The first source is look into history, look into the traditional healers, what did they do? Also archaeology. Go on Google Scholar and have a look what people used and what effects they experienced. I've shown you here some, call it art, and you also see that a mushroom is depicted. So back in the days, people did not have conventional medicines. That were their conventional medicines. So let's learn from people who know it the best. That is why I also like the older studies. MEPS, the Association for Psychedelic Studies, has a good library with these old studies, and I think we can take greater steps if we look into the old history. What I also like is the anecdotal evidence. So people take it, and people take it for a reason. So let's take advantage of that knowledge and listen to them. And that is what we did in a survey study where we asked people, do you use psychedelics? Do you use psychedelics to self-medicate? And a proportion of people indicated that they did. So my talk will now, yeah, that is that you see everything. That was not the intention, but anyway. So I want to move to the anecdotal evidence. And here is one of the anecdotes of a person on a website. And he or she stated that with microdosing, he or she overcame his depression, and the person also experienced mood effects, mood elevating effects, felt more productive, and felt more creative. So here you see that microdosing is stated. So I'm going to talk about microdosing today. I picked my topic. And why? Yeah, because we do research into that, because it is hyping the last years. And yeah, actually something that I always tell, but it's not in my presentation now. It's not that new, because Albert Hofmann already mentioned it in the 70s, that taking small doses of a psychedelic could be useful in treating depression or other psychopathologies. So the definition is that the person takes 1/10 of a regular dose. But what is a regular dose? So if you take a look at lab studies, people give 100 to 200 milligrams of a psychedelic. So 1/10 would be between 10 and 20 micrograms. It is to improve certain aspects without disrupting it, and it's not producing perceptual or hallucinogenic effects. So how can you create new knowledge? I already told you that you can look into anecdotes. That is what we did. So we asked people, why do you microdose? And that were the main motives people gave. So to indeed increase energy, enhance performance. But what was interesting is that they also stated to use it for self-medication, for psychological and physical symptoms. So there is a need. What more can you use to come up with evidence is do naturalistic studies. We do that too. We go to retreats where people take mushrooms or ayahuasca and then test their performance. What we mostly do is placebo-controlled studies, and that is what I'm going to talk about today. That is the gold standard. So we recruit people from the general population. We give them a psychedelic, and we give them a placebo, and then test the effects on performance. And if the performance is better after the psychedelic compared to placebo, we know that the drug is linked to that substance. So what we did is, and it's not about psilocybin now, but it's about LSD. So what we did, like I told you, what is a microdose? And we were not sure about that. So what do? If you're not sure, you do a study, you do a dose finding study. And in that study, we gave participants a placebo, 5 micrograms, 10 micrograms, and 20 micrograms of LSD. And we tested a range of effects. So I'm showcasing here two things that I think are beautiful results. We showed also that attention was enhanced, but we also showed that if people are presented or with a painful stimulus, they're longer able to stand this painful stimulus. So that could mean that the implication could be, or the application of the LSD in a microdose could be that it's efficient in pain conditions or pain disorders. What we also showed, and that is something I'm actually proud of, is that we showed an increase in BDNF in blood plasma. So that means that neuroplasticity is enhanced. That is also something that is shown after giving people higher doses of ayahuasca. That is also something you see when giving ketamine to depressed patients. There probably linked to therapeutic effects. And my connection is a bit unstable. So what I also want to show is this is the study we did, dose finding study, and another lab did that too. And they also showed they did not do the pain perception task, but they showed similar effects on mood enhancing effects of microdoses of LSD. And they also showed effects on the amygdala, so the emotion center in the brain. So that proves that a microdose can change biology, something that is sometimes debated, that people state it is just a placebo effect. So these effects show that it does something, not only acting as a placebo. And the last thing I want to show you is another lab that also a study with microdoses in elderly, which is also highly interesting. We did it in healthy volunteers. We gave a single dose because it was a dose finding study. What they did is giving it repeatedly. That is how you microdose. They did not show a lot of effects. They showed something on time perception, but they also showed that it's safe to use. So my conclusion is that microdosing, up till now, there is only a handful of studies that have been done into that, placebo-controlled then. Microdosing has small effects, but they're not superceptual. As I said in the beginning, this is the definition of microdosing, that you do not experience psychedelic effects. Our participants did not experience psychedelic effects, but they show some people saw something moving. So yeah, but that was not for everybody, but it's just to tell you that if we would give it to people, that should be on the label, that it can cause perceptual changes, but minor ones. We also, so I said we showed improved attention, but on a working memory task, we also showed on one parameter an impairment, and also on another parameter, no effects. So it are selective effects. The effects are partially in line with higher doses. We have shown that one dose works in healthy volunteers. So more research has to be conducted in patients now. Is it safe? That is always a question people ask. The data suggests it is, but we need to know what it does to people if you give it repeatedly. And indeed, it were statistically significant effects, but we still have to show whether they are clinically relevant. Like I said, it enhances neuroplasticity. We did not link it to a behavioral measure. So future research has to show that. A last question is psychedelic medicine needed? And then my answer is take a look at conventional treatment. Take a look at difficulties that are experienced and the challenges that are experienced. Ask psychiatrists what they encounter, ask patients what problems they encounter, and then compare it to psychedelics and what effects these could have. So just to wrap up, what are we doing in Maastricht? We are doing a lot. We're doing a lot of survey studies. An example is a study with psychedelics and ADHD. We do naturalistic studies with ayahuasca, but also we do an online study with San Pedro. And we're doing a series of placebo-controlled studies in healthy volunteers with the 2CB psilocybin kratom, that is metragine. And we're at the moment running an LSD microdosing study together with Amanda Fielding, who is also present here. And for the 2CB and psilocybin study, we also include imaging, functional imaging. We will also run some patient studies in ADHD, Parkinson's, and PTSD. And I want to thank all the people who contributed to this microdosing study. And then I give the floor back to Anna. And I thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. We've already got questions coming into the Q&A, which we will get to when we've gone through everyone's talk. But thank you so much for that. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Fernanda Paljano, who will be talking about ayahuasca and depression. So Fernanda holds a master's and PhD in neuroscience from the Brain Institute of UFRN and has been studying ayahuasca since 2010. And she's evaluated the effects both in healthy volunteers during her master's and in patients with treatment-resistant depression. So I'll hand over to you now, Fernanda. Thanks very much.
Hi, Anna. Thank you for this introduction. I'm really glad to be here in this panel. I want to thank Joe and Drug Science for inviting me. So let me share my screen. I hope you are seeing. So, yeah, so what I want to share with you today is some insights we had from ayahuasca, a randomized controlled trial we performed here in Brazil during my PhD to test ayahuasca for treatment-resistant depression. So first, I want to talk a little bit about ayahuasca. What is it? So ayahuasca is the psychedelic brew from Amazonia origin, which is used for centuries by indigenous populations, and also since the 30s has been a sacrament for several syncretic churches. These churches were at the beginning in Brazil, but today they are like spread all around the world. The most common preparation for ayahuasca is to mix the leaves of the Psychotria viridis with the bark of a liana, the Banisteriopsis capi. These two plants are mixed together and boiled with water for hours or even days. And at the end, we have this brownish colored liquid with a very peculiar taste and smell. From a pharmacological point of view, we consider ayahuasca as a classic psychedelic. The leaves of the Psychotria viridis has the N,N-dimethyltryptamine, which is a serotonin agonist. When we taken this DMT orally, we have some enzymes in our gastrointestinal tract that degrade the substance and it prevents the effect. On the other hand, we have in the bark, in the liana, we have some Armala alkaloids, which contains MAO inhibitors. So when taken together, these Armala alkaloids will prevent the action of the monoamine oxidase, allowing the DMT to reach the brain and provoke its effects. Since 2006-2007, our group, which is led by Dr. Doubleblind has been investigating the antidepressant effects of ayahuasca. So in this first open label study, six patients participated in a study with a single dose of ayahuasca, in which we assessed the depressive symptoms using psychiatric scales. These are questionnaires and with some questions to assess the severity of depression. So we observed a very impressive antidepressant response, which begins 1 day after the dosing and lasted for 21 days. But this was a small sample study. So we had a subsequent study with 17 patients, and which we assessed the same scales, but also we performed a cerebral blood flow assessment evaluation 8 hours after the session. Here we again we observed antidepressant effect, which started already during the session, 40 minutes after the dosing, and which lasted also 21 days. We also observed some increase in blood flow in regions which may be involved in depression, such as the nucleus accumbens and amygdala and insula and the subgenual anterior cortex. So these results are very impressive, very promising, but we have a limitation due the design of the trial. In both studies that I show, we used an open label design, which means that both patients and doctors knew the treatment administered. So in this type of design, we can face a huge placebo effect. So we cannot say if what we saw it was due to ayahuasca or to this placebo effect. So to address this issue, we used a gold standard design, which is to do a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And here you can see the whole protocol we used. The experimental session lasted for 4 days. And besides using the psychiatric scales, we also assessed several measurements as neuropsychological tests, fMRI scans, sleep EEG. We also collected blood and saliva samples to those hormones and biochemical markers. And all these measures were done just before, 1 day before the dosing session, and also 1 day and 2 days after the dosing session. We also had a psychiatric evaluation 7 days after. It's important to say that here we had 2 groups. So it was a parallel design trial. We had one group of patients who took ayahuasca and another group of patients that took placebo. And these patients were treatment-resistant depressive patients that they were like experience depression for a long time. And also they had tried at least 2 conventional treatments before underwent the trial. So as a result, we found this rapid antidepressant effect of ayahuasca, which you can see here in this graph. So here again, we have this scale, psychiatric scale, which evaluates the severity of depression. Higher the scores, higher is the severity. In red, we show ayahuasca group, and blue, the placebo group. So you can see that here already at day 1 day after a single dose of ayahuasca, we see a significantly decrease in depression, in the depressive symptoms from ayahuasca group. We also noticed that the placebo group has a decrease in the symptoms. So as expected, we saw a placebo effect, but we can see that these reductions in the symptoms from the ayahuasca group are more robust and also last longer. Indeed, you can see that here, 7 days after the dosing, we had this great between groups difference. So this is very interesting. And then we want to take a next step, investigating what this is happening, or what are the mechanisms behind this antidepressant effect. As Kim mentioned, now we have a lot of people studying these non-hallucinogenic psychedelics and analogs. So with this new research, that's a lot of debate going on whether the subjective effects from the psychedelics are necessary or not to these positive outcomes we are seeing. So here in our trial, we try to explore this a little bit further, and we assessed both the subjective effects during the session. So here I show we use this hallucinogen rate scale to assess changes in perception, cognition during the session, and we observed that the ayahuasca group had significantly high scores on these scales, except for the effect. And more interesting, we found that the visual perception changes were positively correlated with the improvements in the MADRS scale. In other words, the patients who during the session experienced more visual changes, visual effects, were that they improved more 7 days after the dosing. On the other hand, as I said before, we also assessed some biochemical markers, such as the cortisol, which is a hormone related to stress and which seems to be changed by depression. We also assess the BDNF, this molecule, which is related to the neuroplasticity and also plays an important role in depression, and some inflammatory biomarkers as the C-reactive protein that seems also to be altered by depression. So in all these cases, what we showed is the ayahuasca can modulate these biochemical markers. And more than that, we also found that that's a correlation between the improvement, or in the case, for example, in the C protein reactive, which is at the baseline, it's normally increased in patients with depression. We saw that after the treatment with ayahuasca, these levels were reduced, and this reduction were positively correlated with the reduction in depressive symptoms. So to conclude, we found in this trial that ayahuasca has a rapid antidepressant effect. We believe that the underlying effects we are observing with ayahuasca are indeed multifactorial and ranging from biochemical changes to more subtle subjective process. And I believe that this work supports the therapeutic value and the safety of the psychedelics when administered in an appropriate setting to help treat depression. I want to thank all the group of people which help with collecting data, analyzing the data, and this was a 2.5 years trial. And thank you to Dr. Braulio, which was my supervisor at the PhD, and thank you all.
Great, thank you so much for that. That was so exciting. I'm very excited for our Q&A that's going to come up in a bit. But thank you for sharing with us. So it's now my great pleasure to invite our final speaker of this section. So this is Maria Papasphirou, and I'm very sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. Maria is an integrative psychotherapist, clinical supervisor, and family constellation practitioner. She is the co-founder and co-director of the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy and has worked for more than 20 years in mental health, trauma, and education. On top of this, she is also the co-editor of Psychedelic Mystery and Feminine and Psychedelics and Psychotherapy, The Healing Power of Extended States. So I'll hand over to you now, Maria.
Thank you, Anna. You pronounced it really well. It doesn't happen very often. So let me just share the screen. Thank you, Drug Science. It's really lovely to be here, to have my work sit alongside the work of others, and to open up this wider dialogue of healing and treatment that I will be talking about. So I'm trying to, perfect. So the depth relational process model developed during a 2-year journey where me and my psychiatrist colleague, Dr. Tim Reed, we were editing an anthology on psychedelics and psychotherapy. This book was an integration process for both of us. We learned a lot. We developed our ideas around this work and our position in the field and what we really want to align our energies towards. Currently, psychedelic work has had very specific frameworks and applications. They often tend to be brief and purpose specific. So on one hand, we have the scientific research that focuses on gathering data and by definition has both limited scope and resources because of its very nature. And on the other hand, we have the retreat model, which again does not often pay attention to the longer term process that inner work usually requires. In addition to that, our collective understanding of the processes of discomfort, illness, health, repair, regeneration has been conditioned by the medical paradigm. And while the medical paradigm can be extremely relevant in certain situations, it can have limited applicability when we talk about depth psychological work. So there are two matters I would like to really briefly touch on today here. One is the paradigm of healing versus the paradigm of treatment. And the other is the need for theoretical integration of many different models and the capacity to really be able to move from one to the other if we are to really support the enormous breadth and depth that the psychedelic experience opens us up to. So I will very briefly outline a few major points of contrast between healing and treatment. There's a blog post on my website, which is The Path of Healing, that fleshes this out a little bit more, but it's going to be very brief here today. So the first major point of difference between these two paradigms is that in treatment, what we see as painful and undesirable, it tends to be excluded from the whole and treated in isolation. But when we talk about healing, then the work follows the movements of inclusion. It really asks that we relate to our symptoms in meaningful ways. The second point I'd like to bring here is that in the treatment paradigm, the agency is located primarily outside of us. It rests with a doctor, a pill, a course of treatment that we hope will free us from our unwanted symptoms. So that tends to be what we talk about in this field as the magic bullet approach. In the healing paradigm, the primary agency really rests firmly within ourselves, and it really relies on our level of engagement and participation. The third point is that whilst in treatment, the unconscious remains as a separate and excluded part of the process, in healing, healing work really rests on both the input and the integration of the unconscious. In treatment, the unconscious facts that are carried forward by symptoms into consciousness, they get silenced and they remain unintegrated. But healing work really strives to receive the guidance of the unconscious through the symptoms. The fourth point is that whereas treatment exists at a fixed point in time, our engagement with the movements of healing is a lifelong journey, and it requires our ongoing engagement, with throughout our lives, throughout its various cycles. We really have to engage with the fullness of our inner world. So it's an ongoing process. The fifth point is that the treatment modality holds a very clear boundary between patient and expert. But in healing work, the expert is the patient, and the healing process moves organically through both of them. Carl Jung has said the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there's any reaction, both must be transformed. Despite their differences, both these modalities spring from a desire to be in service and a deep desire to find ways to restore the human body, the human capacity, the human spirit. In fact, these three are always interconnected. So like the yin and yang, their different offerings bridge the opposites of the world of repair and regeneration. We really have to acknowledge their individual limitations and their individual strengths. We have to recognize that one cannot really replace the other, and that often we need to include both. Myself and my colleague Tim Reed, we have co-founded the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy, IPT for short, and through that structure we support the continuing development of professionals in this field, and we offer a 2-year training in the depth relational process model we have co-developed. In IPT, we acknowledge the contributions of both modalities, but we place greater emphasis on the deeper layers that psychedelic inner work sometimes requires for its gradual unfolding. Our depth relational process training model, it's an integrative model. It draws from various other models in order to become a cohesive whole. and it rests on 10 pillars of knowledge. And we think that bringing these 10 pillars together, we really can develop and support skillful and safe therapeutic work with expanded states of consciousness. So I'm going to very quickly go through its main ingredients. So the first pillar is psychedelic science, and all we have learned for working with these substances from the various research trials for various clinical conditions in treatment-specific and controlled settings. And what we're really interested in is how can the findings of these studies have some application for short-term psychotherapy work. The second pillar is the skills for supporting the preparation and the integration. Any practitioner that opens the space for such a journey must first and foremost be well equipped for the responsibility, firstly, to prepare the participants for the experience, support them as they re-emerge from the deep psyche, and support them as they reintegrate into their everyday lives. The third pillar is about cultivating deep presence for the participants in session process. So this is about what happens within a session. The in-session psychedelic therapeutic work is being led by the medicines and the participants' inner world, their inner healing intelligence. We are no longer the expert dealing with the patient. Here we sit with people human to human, and such presence requires that we have done our own inner work and that we consistently engage with our inner work. The fourth pillar is psychodynamic and attachment perspectives, and this is really crucial for the work. Attachment theory shows how the deeply ingrained relational patterns that we develop during early infancy and childhood continue to operate in adult life, mostly on an unconscious level. Experiences in expanded states can reinforce, radically disrupt, and potentially repair these very early relational patterns. From a psychodynamic perspective, these patterns get highlighted in expanded states through what we call transferential dynamics and reenactments. This is what psychotherapists call transference, countertransference, projection, projective identification. It's when psychic material that belong to other experiences somehow get reenacted in another relationship. Practitioners need to be able to tune into their emotional experience of sitting with the person so they can skillfully respond rather than react to such reenactments. And they have to be able to support reparative openings that happen in the therapeutic space. The fifth pillar is working in trauma-informed ways to support resolution and healing and to avoid re-traumatization. Traumatic memories that will emerge in expanded states will sometimes have narrative and clear memories attached to them, but sometimes they may be deeply embodied. They may be beneath conscious memory. And sometimes they will arise from wider collective and sociopolitical experiences. It is really important for psychedelic therapists that they're able to support participants, firstly, to regulate the participants through this process and these openings, secondly, to facilitate release of these openings with somatic methods of support. The sixth pillar is transpersonal psychology. This is the higher and spiritual aspects of human consciousness. What's relevant here is Groff's map of consciousness and his work on birth perinatal matrices. Jung's understanding of the symbolic, mythic, and archetypal representations of the deep psyche, as well as the wisdom and practices of the timeless spiritual traditions, practices like meditation or any other spiritual practice supports the practitioner to understand these territories. The seventh pillar is being able to support with this sort of psychological crisis that can emerge after a psychedelic experience. We refer to them as spiritual emergency or emergence. And practitioners need to be skilled in supporting, this is essentially an ego-death rebirth process. And practitioners have to be able to support the person move through the journey and also have a very deep understanding of the purposefulness of challenging and difficult psychedelic experiences. The eighth pillar is indigenous, shamanic, and animistic perspectives. At the heart of these ancient medicine practices lies the tribal perspective of initiation. This is a process of deep transformation that is best held through community and ritual frameworks. The ritual frameworks help animate our internal and external worlds and help us really relate with the unseen dimensions of life. The ninth pillar is about the resolution of intergenerational and ancestral work. It's often trauma, and that can arise through such experiences. And we can understand this both from indigenous perspectives, but also from Western paradigms like psychotherapy and the very exciting newly emerging field of epigenetic research. Practitioners really have to understand the emotional vitality that this work carries and to be able to hold such space, such timeless space. The final pillar is ecosystemic approaches. It's about honoring the interconnectedness that permeates our inner and outer worlds. Psychedelic states really tap into the deeper processes we see in nature, the fertile cycles of death and rebirth, of regeneration, and they can move us away from egocentric and ethnocentric positions to ecocentric perspectives. So this is about a shifting sense of self, a widening of self, and a capacity to engage with the bigger picture and understand the intricate webs of life in a much clearer way. This is our work in brief. We have opened up this space for practitioners, both professionals that can join us as members, and they can participate in our CPD structures. You can find more details on our website if you are a professional that wishes to participate in such a process. And we also have the public keynote events that support a collective deepening inquiry into the depth relational process perspective. We have our next event on Monday. It's with a Jungian analyst, Jerome Brown, who is also training with the Shipipo tribe and brings the rare gift of marrying the two. And he stands really for what we stand, which is integrating clinical solid practice with indigenous perspectives. We're at a moment in time where these medicines are becoming more available. The challenges and opportunities of this process is really for us to grapple with. And this is the chance to usher a wholly new paradigm of how we're engaging with illness and health. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I've never really thought about the difference between healing and treatment. And that shows you everything that's wrong with medicine at the moment. Okay, so we haven't got that long for questions, but we'll try and get through as many as we can. So Kim, if we start with you, there were questions about how you selected your participants and I guess what the kind of experimental paradigm was. You know, did they have to stay in a lab or could they go home?
Yes, sorry, I was still answering the questions. I answered that one too. It was in the lab and it was in a separate room where the participants stayed the whole day. Mm-hmm. At least for the 6 hours after the administration. There was a bed, a table, a chair, so it was a comfortable room. And how we select our participants. So we have a tradition of selecting only people who have experience with the substance that dates back from the time we started with MDMA. And we wanted to have people who we knew that would have a good experience and would be physically able to tolerate it. But now, since a couple of years, we have, or since a year, I think, we just include everybody who wants to participate. They are physically screened, so there should not be a problem.
Fantastic, thank you. And Fernanda, a similar question, well, sort of along the same vein, came up with you about placebo. So what is the placebo that you use, and how possible is it to really blind a trial when you're using a psychedelic?
Yes, so this is really a challenge. I think no one has the answer. So one thing we did was just contrary what Kim said, we selected people who were naive to ayahuasca, because as I mentioned, like ayahuasca is very peculiar. If you taste once, it's very hard to blind, and so we choose people who were naive, who had never tried ayahuasca, and they were also naive for all psychedelics, so they didn't know what to expect. We prepared them before the session, explain what could happen, but they didn't know. And also we designed a placebo who had some, provoke some gastrointestinal distress, because one of the known effects of ayahuasca is to provoke nausea and vomiting. So we designed this effect. So it was not a psychoactive placebo, so no psychoactive properties, but it had this active properties in the sense of causing a little bit of nausea, and so people was like confusing. And also it was important to mention that during the trial we had a team of psychiatrists. So the psychiatrist who evaluated the patient before the trial, before the session, was not the same that accompanied the patient during the session. Also to try to not have this bias, because also if you talk with someone who has experienced a psychedelic effect, you can also know that he took the substance.
Great, thank you very much. And Maria, a question for you is in the preparation. So you spoke about one of the pillars being the preparation, and then actually it's so important that therapists know how to prepare patients. And what goes into that preparation?
A lot. I mean, part of the preparation is psychological assessment to ensure that the person is robust enough psychologically to be able to make use of such experience and whatever might arise. The other is to prepare them for what might open up, so really inform them. It's an educational aspect. The other is to, a lot of research studies have been talking a lot about really preparing for the potential for disappointment. The expectations can be very high for such an experience. And the other very important aspect is intention. So there's something about the direction that the person brings to this work, and the energy that they bring from that intention into the work. That's also useful for other reasons, when the work can become quite difficult. Going back to one's intention can be really really grounding and really helpful for remaining engaged with a possibly difficult experience. The other really important aspect of the preparation is that a relationship is really building between the participant and the person that's going to be guiding the session. This work requires enormous levels of trust and a sense of safety. So this is the time to really forge links between the 2 or 3 or 4 people that will work together, between one's relationship with their own inner world, the main issues they wish to address. So it ranges. There are people that would, settings that would argue for preparation being quite brief and a 3 or 4 session process, and others that would argue that sometimes preparation should be a 1 year in therapy process where one learns to sit with oneself and difficulty.
Thank you. I've got 2 minutes to ask one more question. Kim, I know you've answered a few in the chat, so Fernando, I might ask you one more, which you've probably got time for. And that's about whether you think the beneficial effects of ayahuasca, is it coming from, is it sort of is it the active ingredients, or do you need more components of the plant? So I suppose more like cannabis, where actually there's a lot of things that contribute to the effect.
Yeah, this is very interesting to ask. So I don't know. The answer is I don't know. But I believe that that's more, that the other substance play also a role in what we're seeing. Because like here I talked about DMT and the Ahmal alkaloids. But in these Ahmal alkaloids, we have like ahmine, narmalin, and tetrahydroamine, but also a lot of others that we cannot measure because they are like in small concentrations. But I think they could also be playing a role. And also I think it's important to mention that all these studies we have and the traditional use is based on this traditional form of ayahuasca. So the safety that we are like attesting here, that we see with the use by a lot of people, and also in the clinical trials, are from the traditional form. So I don't know what can happen if you isolated the DMT and the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, but only these two together, and what it can cause. So yeah, I believe that maybe like cannabis, we have an entourage effect that can.
Thank you. So sadly, that's all that we have time for. I could keep asking questions forever. I've got so many follow-ups, and I know our audience have lots of questions. Hopefully some of you might be able to have those answered via text on the Q&A function. Thank you all so much for those talks. That was very inspiring. And yeah, thank you for answering those questions. So I'll now hand over to Anne.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to all the speakers. It was really an excellent session, and I look forward to follow up with hopefully another great session. So we're starting with Amanda Fielding, Countess of Weymouth and March, and she doesn't really need much of an introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Amanda has dedicated over 50 years to the scientific exploration of psychedelics in the belief that modern science can be used to understand, validate and optimize the healing potential of psychedelic medicines. She has been done hand behind the renaissance in psychedelic science. And in 1998, she set up the Beckley Foundation to open up the doors of scientific research into the potential benefits of psychedelics. The Beckley Foundation works to develop a scientific evidence base to help reform global drug policies so that these compounds can be made available to patients in need. And I would like to say also Amanda was a recent Drug Science podcast guest together with Professor David Nutt, so please do check it out. And Amanda is going to speak about 50 years of psychedelic research, and I would just like to take this opportunity to welcome Amanda. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to speak here. And Joe has very kindly asked me to talk about my life and work. And I'll try to summarize 50 long years in 10 rapid minutes as best I can. And I might revert to reading my notes because I can't remember it in that much detail. Anyway,
presentation.
Yeah, what? Yes. Apologies for the confusion. Since early childhood, I've had a lifelong passion for altered states of consciousness and mysticism that most likely stems from a very isolated childhood, and the fact that I had a godfather who was a Buddhist monk whom I never met. At 16, I left school, having won the school science prize, because the nuns refused to give me books on Buddhism. So I decided to educate myself. I set off with £25 in my pocket to travel to Ceylon to see my godfather. I never got there, but had all sorts of adventures on the way, living with the Bedouin in the Syrian desert, dervish dancers, sadhus, etc. I later studied mysticism under Professor Zaina at All Souls in Oxford, and classical Arabic. When I was 16, I first smoked cannabis, and at 22, I was introduced to LSD. My flat became a center of psychedelic activity. In 1966, the spring of 1966, my life changed when I met an exceptional Dutch scientist called Bart Huges. He had two new hypotheses of how psychedelics work in the brain, how there's a change in the ratio between blood and cerebrospinal fluid in the brain, meaning that you have more blood in the brain capillaries, more function. And with that understanding and a new understanding of the ego as a conditioned reflex mechanism, I felt a complete change in my lifestyle. And I felt I had found my mission and what I wanted to do with my life. And so for the next 30 years, we more or less lived on LSD, maintaining our concentration by taking daily vitamin C and extra glucose to maintain a normal glucose level in the blood. We studied consciousness and human sciences. I was always looking for doctors, scientists, and journalists to work with, but it was very difficult to make much progress in those days because psychedelics were so taboo. During this period, I did many things like painting and conceptual artworks, like standing for Parliament, in order to spread the message, the many advantages of altered states of consciousness. I gave interviews and exhibitions. 60 Minutes did a documentary about me, but all too often the taboo won through and the project was suppressed at the last moment. I looked on the taboo as the enemy to be overcome with clever tricks. In 1998, I decided to become a foundation. It was my latest artwork. To turn myself into a foundation, it was like a Trojan horse, so that I could do research I'd longed to do for all the 30 years and reform global drug policies, as was necessary in order to do the research. Back then, only very few researchers would dare risking their careers with respectability to engage in research for these compounds. But I was lucky to have the support of many brilliant scientists who agreed to join my scientific advisory board, such as Albert Hoffman, Colin Blakemore, Ralph McCoolin, Trevor Robbins, Dave Nutt, and others. My first research project was in 1998 with Franz Vollenweider, investigating the changes in cerebral circulation brought about by psilocybin using PET. Changes in blood circulation was one of my great passions. Later, I persuaded Professor Dave Nutt, then Professor of Neuropharmacology in Bristol, to collaborate with me investigating cannabis and psychedelics. And a few years later, in 2007, we set up the Beckley Imperial Research Program and appointed Robin Cahart Harris to be principal investigator. The first breakthrough study we conducted was a neuroimaging study in healthy people looking at the effects of psilocybin on brain function. This study produced groundbreaking results, identifying for the first time a decrease in the function of the default mode network, a network that is overactive in depression and other psychological disorders, and also a dramatic increase in connectivity of networks in the rest of the brain, as represented by these now famous homological scaffolds. This study led us to develop the pilot trial for treatment-resistant depression, which received funding from the Medical Research Council. This clinical study played a pivotal role in the field of psychedelic research, inspiring many others to step in through the door that we had opened. But my real passion has always been LSD, and it was to me a real achievement to finally be able to conduct the first neuroimaging study with LSD. This study produced groundbreaking results published in PNAS, which had great impact in our understanding of how psychedelics work. It was launched at the Royal Society, London, as I thought that was a right honor to Albert Hoffman, and shedding light on the neurobiology of consciousness, as well as on the potential applications of LSD as an invaluable tool for psychopathology and indeed enhancement of humanity's qualities. This study produced groundbreaking results. And the pioneering study is still producing many articles with leading neuroscientists from around the world contributing to exploring the database with the cutting-edge tools. Wonderfully, brainwashing is ever getting better. And at the moment, I'm just starting a study, which I think might be able to look more carefully into the difference in the blood between the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. After this work with full dose LSD, I decided to focus our research on LSD microdosing, as I had experienced the benefits of this practice in the 60s, where I called the daily use of LSD a psychovitamin to enhance cognition and mood. Results from our first study, in collaboration with Jan Rummeke and Kim Kuiper from Maastricht University, confirmed what I had already experienced, i.e. an increase in mood and vitality with LSD microdosing, particularly in the higher range at 20 mics. Our study also demonstrated that LSD microdosing can enhance tolerance to pain, opening a new avenue of therapeutic applications. Importantly, we were able to show that LSD microdosing produced not only subjective changes, but also physiological changes with enhanced levels of BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, a biomarker of neuroplasticity measured several hours after the dose. This is particularly exciting as and clinically relevant. BDNF is a very important protein whose deficit appears to underlie a range of health conditions from diabetes to depression, and many researchers consider it to be a biomarker of therapeutic response and also a potential target for treatment of major depressive disorder. We are currently conducting a follow-up study that will look in more detail at the relationship between brain plasticity and changes in mood and cognition, and also collaborating with another group on a study looking at the effects of LSD microdosing in depressed individuals. In parallel to this work, I've also been developing a translational research program in Brazil in order to investigate the effects of LSD on neuroplasticity and cognitive functioning, and its potential for the treatment of neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's and many others. Sadly, I don't have much time to develop on my current research interests, but in short, my three main areas of research interest are mental health, with more research on microdosing for the treatment of depression and anxiety, aging, with studies on neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and also on microdosing in palliative care, and the use of psychedelics for self-development and exploration of consciousness and the mystical experience. It's been a long and difficult road, but my hard work in psychedelic research is paying off, and the tide is very clearly turning, with mainstream media, even the most conservative, acknowledging the relevance and value of psychedelics in our modern society. These are very exciting times ahead, with a lot of new opportunities, and the Beckley Foundation needs more than ever financial support to continue pushing the limits of our knowledge on these compounds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. That was great. And it's just such an interesting run through throughout the past 50 years. It was just amazing. And I think Ross said it the last time, really the work we're doing now and that's presented today, for example, as well as in our other seminars, is really we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Like you said, it's been a long road. It's been a very difficult road. It's maybe now, hopefully now is the time. society's attitudes are changing. We're going to do questions at the end of the session once we've had our 3 speakers. If participants, if audience would like to put some questions in the chat, that would be amazing. So much to discuss. I would like to move forward because I know we're very tight with our 10 minutes for each participant, to introduce Serena. So Serena View is from LA, California. I hope I'm getting this right. So very exciting news from California, I think, today as well. Serena is a co-founding partner of Plant Medicine Law Group, a law firm focused on psychedelics as well as cannabis law. And she's a strong proponent of safe, legal, and equitable access to plant medicine. And really, so important, this kind of work in light of the current discussion regarding intellectual property, indigenous rights, and the changes in law possibly happening in California. So welcome, Serena. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on this panel. And kind of like what Amanda is saying, the tide is changing. So I'm just going to be talking a lot from the US perspective to the policy changes with respect to psychedelics over the years. The status quo is that in the US, the Controlled Substances Act classifies most psychedelics as Schedule 1, which means that there's no accepted medical use and there's a high potential for abuse. Psychedelics such as DMT, ibogaine, LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin. And the scheduling is a little bit different in the UK and other countries, but this is the general notion. Psychedelics are, they don't have medical use, or there's a high potential for abuse. Ketamine, which is a psychoactive anesthesia, is Schedule 3 in the US, and it can be prescribed off-label for depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And it's the only legal psychedelic in the US market at the moment. But the regulatory landscape is changing. There's so many clinical studies in the US, Canada, in UK, and other countries that are supporting the notion that there is value and there is profound therapeutic potential for these compounds, and at the same time showing that the use of psychedelics is fairly safe compared to other substances. And in the US, there is a growing movement to change drug policy at the local and the state levels. There are 3 main models to drug policy reform: medicalization, decriminalization, and legalization. Under the medicalization model, as many of the speakers here today have talked about their research, one of the ways to get access to psychedelics is through a prescription through your doctor. And as Amanda mentioned, psychedelics are becoming mainstream just in the past year or so. So many articles have come out to highlight the positive results of various clinical studies in the US as well as abroad. And what has been instrumental in marching us forward to establishing a medical model for psychedelics are the pioneering research done by the Beckley Foundation, MAPS, the Imperial College, King's College, Johns Hopkins, NYU, and many more institutions. So in the medical model, what happens is that psychedelics are being studied. They go through the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, process like any other prescription drugs. And once they're approved, then the research institutions and companies, to gain approval, they have to get FDA, they have to start working with FDA as well as get the DEA exemptions to conduct clinical trials with a specific substance. And so far, the progress in the US has been very promising. The FDA has fast-tracked MDMA and psilocybin to treat depression by granting them breakthrough status. And MDMA is expected to be approved by in a couple of years in the MAPS trials. They're currently in the second half of the phase 3 of the trial. So once it's approved, what this means is that doctors can prescribe MDMA for depression, and at the same time, they can also prescribe MDMA for off-label conditions. So in the US, once the drug is approved by the FDA, so long as there's some kind of good faith judgment and there is some scientific research to support use for unapproved conditions, a doctor can prescribe an approved drug for off-label uses. So medicalization model is what most people are thinking about with respect to how people would access psychedelics to treat various type of mental health conditions, but also possibly other types of conditions with respect to neurodegenerative diseases. But there's also a lot of movement in the ground to decriminalize. And decriminalization means that it's reducing or removing the criminal penalties or descheduling the substances, going from Schedule 1, which is you can't prescribe it, it's illegal to use, it's prohibitive, to some other lower schedule. And certain countries have already decriminalized personal use and possession of psychedelics. So for example, it's well known that in Spain, drug use and possession for personal use do not even constitute a criminal offense. In Portugal, they've decriminalized all drugs in 2001. In the US, while there is a federal prohibition on psychedelics, many local jurisdictions are pushing for decriminalization. So in 2019, the city of Denver made personal possession and use of psilocybin the lowest enforcement priority. Since then, 10 other cities followed, especially in the last year in 2020. And in addition to just personal possession, these other cities also expanded to include planting, cultivating, purchasing, transporting, and distributing psilocybin and entheogenic plants for personal use as the lowest law enforcement priority. So these initiatives don't mean, they're not true decriminalization because the penalties have not changed and there could be enforcement by state enforcers. However, practically speaking, users in these cities may feel more protected for their personal use, personal cultivation, personal possession of psilocybin or other psychedelics. And these measures are a move in the right direction to change drug policy. And 2 states actually even went further to reduce penalties for personal possession. In Oregon, like with Portugal, they decriminalized all drugs. They made personal possession a violation. In New Jersey, they made personal possession of psilocybin a disorderly offense, and the fine is now $1,000 or 6 months in jail, or both. The penalty used to be 3 to 5 years in jail and a fine up to $15,000. And there are many states in the US right now that have, I think about 9, that have proposed bills to decriminalize, either deschedule or reduce the penalty for non-commercial activities such as personal use, cultivation, harvesting, possession for psilocybin or other entheogenic plants. And overall, decriminalization is not legalization. The city initiatives, these state initiatives, they make it usually less risky for users to possess and consume for personal reasons, but drug trafficking, drug dealing, really the supply side of the equation is still being criminalized. And some states are pushing for a legalization model to try to solve that issue. And legalization really refers to like the affirmative approval or permission to do something. And there are many examples in other countries where certain psychedelics are legal. For example, in Peru, ayahuasca is legal for distribution, sale, consumption, etc. In the Netherlands, it's with truffles. In a few other countries, Costa Rica, Jamaica, Mexico, it's not per se legal, but certain psychedelics they're not illegal, meaning more practically speaking, they're not being regulated, they're not being enforced. There's nothing in the books in those countries to say like a certain psychedelic is legal or illegal. So because they're not regulated, a lot of businesses have started to go to those specific countries to start centers, retreat centers usually, or to do research, because the bureaucratic barriers are, it's easier to get over than it is in countries like the US and going through the FDA process. And in the US, we have one model. The state of Oregon passed an initiative last year to create a program to permit licensed service providers to administer psilocybin for therapeutic use to individuals who are 21 years of age or older. In other words, this establishes a legal model to regulate psilocybin for therapeutic purposes. And therapeutic use is broadly defined, and a diagnosis is not required. And the intention of that is to broaden access to psilocybin, so it's not requiring somebody, like in the medical model, you have to go to a doctor, you have to get a prescription, and then you go and get administered at the doctor's office or some kind of clinical setting. So this is meant to be a little, to open the doors a little bit for other people who might want to use psilocybin but might not necessarily have some kind of diagnosis they can rely on to get access. And there are 4 types of licenses: the facilitator license, the service center, where you can administer and sell the psilocybin, the testing center, and the manufacturer of psilocybin. And essentially, this will create a legal path for commercial activities for psilocybin, trying to solve the supply side of the equation. And a couple of other states in the US are trying to copy this model. Florida is trying to do the same thing, but the bill was killed recently. Maine also proposed a very similar model, and it's being, I think they're waiting to be voted on. And again, the legalization model, it still provides very limited access points right now, because Oregon only allows, permits access to psilocybin, and it's only for therapeutic uses. You have to go to a service provider in order to get the administration, in order to purchase the psilocybin. So it's still limited. There is another, it's not part of the drug reform, but there is another model in the US that's providing for spiritual and religious use of certain type of psychedelics. And that's through a statute. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA for short, it prohibits the government from substantially burdening religious exercise, which also includes, which essentially includes that RFRA can protect a person's sincere religious exercise that uses psychedelics as a sacrament. In 2006, the highest court in the US ruled for the church, Unial de Vegetal, and they won against the DEA for infringing on the church's right and on the organizer's right to use ayahuasca as a sacrament for their religious exercise. And many people are relying on this statute to establish churches throughout the US and for their sacramental use of certain psychedelics. And while there's a path for religious use of psychedelics, there's still many risks. For example, if somebody is importing ayahuasca from abroad, customs can seize that even if it's for religious use. And not every church has all the proper paperwork to support an exemption for religious use. And that's because the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency in the US, they grant very, very, very few exemptions. Their guidance for the exemption applications raises many legal issues. It increases a lot of risk, makes the applicants really a target for potential enforcement and seizure by the DEA. And the whole process do not give many church organizers comfort that their religious use of psychedelics will be respected under the law. So many people are still doing things kind of under the radar and trying to be as discreet as possible, as quiet as possible. And and try to mitigate as many risks as possible. So there are efforts by many nonprofit groups to work with the DA to try to clarify future guidances in dealing with entheogenic churches that are using psychedelics. But again, those conversations are slow, and it might take years of litigation to push the government to respect this type of use. And as you can see, the regulatory landscape in the US and also other countries, it's not uniform. There are many gaps that are not addressed. It makes it an exciting time to be in this space from a legal and regulatory perspective. Drug policy on psychedelics is moving in the right direction, but there's still more to be done. And in the US, I feel like we can learn a lot from the cannabis sector. For example, the policy needs to address demand and ultimately supply, like what Oregon is trying to do with psilocybin. Regulation can be expensive and thus could incentivize people to stay in the illicit market. So it's important for legislators to provide viable paths for people to move from the underground to above ground. And it's also important to remember that millions of people have used psychedelics safely. And that's why I believe it's important to provide safe and equitable access to psychedelics for a variety of reasons, whether it's medical, spiritual, or otherwise. And hopefully the law will catch up and provide for various access points for different people with different purposes and different intentions.
Thank you, Serena. Thank you. That was great. Thanks for providing the yes perspective. And we feel here we have a lot to learn from you guys over there. And in many ways, you seem more advanced, but it was interesting to also hear the kind of issues that you're still facing that continue that still need to be developed and worked on and so on. So again, please keep your questions coming. I can already see some great questions for Serena. If you do want to answer some of them in the chat, Serena, please go ahead. Let's save a couple for later, but quite a few coming. And I would like to introduce Yasmin Pirocek. I hope I pronounced that right. Yasmin is a consultant developing a traditional medicine strategy for the diabetes epidemic in First Nations communities in Canada. She received her master's degree in biology, focusing on boreal forest ethnobotany, very interesting sounding, and she's also a student of Maestro Juan Flores, a plant medicine teacher of the Peruvian Amazon. And she's going to speak about developing a traditional medicine strategy for the diabetes epidemic. Welcome, Jasmine. Looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I'd just like to share the teachings because rarely do we get to share many of the traditional perspectives here in Canada. So in my work, what I've seen with many of my family members and many Indigenous community members in Canada is that many traumas, and the reason why we use psychedelics is because it's so effective for trauma, which many of the panelists have spoken about. But trauma, we know that trauma leads to chronic illness. And this is exemplified by the adverse childhood experience studies done by sociology researchers, that many of these traumas, and especially the traumas that are experienced by Indigenous peoples in Canada, many of the traumas could be avoided and were, I suppose, supported by some even governmental institutions here in Canada as well. So it's been about 130 years of trauma that has not been able to be recovered using our traditional methods. So, and this is really important when I'm going to be talking about health transformation. Health transformation is an idea from a tribal council here in Ontario that plans to integrate plant medicine, any plant medicine, doesn't have to be psychedelic, into the common Western model. Now, health transformation, it's really difficult for many traditional healers and people and practitioners who work with plant medicine in general to integrate into a Western style perspective, because nobody believes in many of the methodologies that we would have used in the past. But it's because of this underlying trauma that was instituted by, you know, our social systems here in Canada of the last 120, 150, 200 years. And so integrating this plant medicine has been a big part of what it is that I'm doing in many of these First Nation communities, and not in my own, because in my own community, there is quite a bit of trauma, and it's a little bit too close to home for me to be able to help in the best ways. So I have a little bit of separation, which is really helpful. In the community that I'm in right now, this is Kenora, Ontario, Canada, and it's has a beautiful Lake of the Woods. And in this area, there were maybe, I think 4 or 5 residential schools where the children, the Indigenous children, were being re-educated to a Western model, and so that people can be reintegrated into a common system that the general government that believes in, so that we can function in the economy, so that we can be hardworking peoples. But we left behind our traditions and our ways of being. So integrating this plant medicine into the Western models that are employed in many of these communities is very, very important for rediscovering and keeping our traditions intact. And even over the last 120 years, we lost a lot of our medicine traditions. We don't have psychedelics like ayahuasca. We have a few that we do use, and we still use tobacco in a sacred way. We call it sama. But the pervading perspectives have limited our uses in general. So this has been a long-term problem. I'm not going to get into that, but the whole point is that there's a sense of hesitancy from the people and from the general population, from the government, to be able to integrate many of these medicines into a model that can be employed for everyone. So this is where I come in as I'm a traditional healer, as well as I used phytochemical methods in my master's of ethnobotany, because I have to be able to explain how many of these compounds work in a body in a Western perspective. So I'm kind of like a bridge between worlds. And so because we don't have these psychedelics the way in which people think we do, my teacher, Maestro Juan Flores, I got very sick at one point in my life, and I was looking for a real healer. And there are many healers in Canada here, and some that are very, very good, but I couldn't get in contact with many of them at the time of my need. And so I somehow found Maestro Juan Flores in the Peruvian Amazon. And in my very first ayahuasca experience, he came to my dream, at the end of the dream, and he said, "You got to come to Peru. Everyone should come to Peru." And he's so special, because the only time I ever saw him, like an image of him, was in National Geographic France. I can't remember which edition it was, but he was at the River of Boiling Water, and that's where his healing center is. And it's a fabulous, miraculous place to be. And just to be there in general is very heartwarming. So I hope that one day that I could return, and even though I'm not there, I continue to study, because I employ his methods that he taught me in the Amazon, here in the boreal forest. Well, I have a mixed wood forest here, so boreal forest, Great Lakes, St. Lawrence tree region. So there's some deciduous trees and there's some evergreen kind of trees, conifers and things like that. And Maestro Juan Flores, he said he could help us. He said he could help the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And I didn't understand at the time what he was completely saying, but he opened my mind, or he helped me to learn how to open my mind and my heart, mostly my heart, enough to be able to see all of these perspectives that I've just shared with everyone. I wasn't able to see many of that because just like every other Indigenous person in Canada, I was stricken with trauma. And many of the methods that he used, like the dieta, the method of dieta, no salt, no sugar, no grease, no exciting foods, they changed my body in a very, very big way. And this is many of the foods that are given to us in the First Nation communities, they're completely processed. They're processed in and it's funny because when you go up to community, they call it white food. And they don't mean white food, they mean urban. Like there's a difference between urban peoples and rural peoples. So when we're given urban foods, we know that these urban foods lead to diabetes, lead to chronic illnesses, heart disease, periodontal disease, which is prevalent. So it's really, really important that that we take time away from this food. So Maestro Juan Flores told me that when you're doing a dieta in the forest, in our forest, that you would eat the traditional food of the people, which is really interesting because when I've been in South America, we have very little meat, but we have all meat here. And we also have a thicker amount of adipose tissue, like brown fat, that protects us from the cold so that we could survive like -50 temperatures. And the Peruvian Amazon, you do not need to survive very, very cold temperatures. It's very, very warm, very sweaty, very hot. So it's a cleansing in and of itself to be at this specific place in the world. So Maestro Juan Flores considered, or helped me to consider, that we could use his methodologies, or the methodologies of the traditional peoples of South America, to be able to communicate with the plants and integrate bring our traditions back to ourselves, because this is what was lost in the last 120 years. We lost almost everything. I was in the UK in 2019 at Breaking Convention, and there was a question from the audience that it was hard for me to answer, because the question was to the peyote folk and to the ayahuasca folk and to the ibogaine peoples, talking about the appropriation of many plant medicines, and I didn't know how to answer. The question was, how is the appropriation of many of these medicines hindering the future of and the viability of many of these plants for future generations? And I told them, and maybe it was frightening, but it was frightening for me to say that we lost them a long, long time ago. Like there's many plant medicines that we use that we just do not talk about either. Like we do not share many of these teachings because we don't want them to be appropriated. But many of the compounds that are available or that are known to be psychoactive, they don't really exist where we are. There's very few. So there's one medicine called the Amanita muscaria formosa, and I can't remember, for any of you science buffs, I can't remember the new name for it, but it's a type of Amanita, and it has the muscimol, the ibotenic acid, and we have whole traditions with this specific medicine, but we don't use it the way in which you would use ayahuasca or ibogaine or psilocybin or anything like that. And so none of the laws really reflect, none of the laws have ever reflected integrating psychedelic medicine from an Indigenous perspective. Many people ask me that, is how do we integrate this, or how do we use the Indigenous people to bring legality to the Canadian markets, and it's like it's non-existent. And even in my undergraduate degree, I'm an archaeologist as well, an anthropologist, and I've seen no evidence, very little evidence that would be able to support a Western perspective of integrating psychedelic medicines into the daily world. So really what I'm bringing is a new paradigm to the people, and it's been very effective. So many Indigenous peoples who have gone through very great, terrible traumas have gone through full month dietas with me and have experienced new ways of thinking and new ways of being and new connections to the land. And this is where we need to go first. Dr. Gabor Mate talks about how connection is like the cure. Connection is a cure to many addictions. So, and his words escape me right now, but I always hold it dear to me, some of his work that he's done in the Lower East Side of Vancouver with many of the people that are very sick there. And we have many people in my region that are just as ill, because the residential schools, the last one just closed in the 1990s, I think 1996. So the need is so great in my city. It's so great. And I know that the ayahuasca has helped the people. And many times I want to help everyone that I can, but it's so difficult when the word church, like if I legally got rights to make a vegetalista church, people don't like the word church because of the residential schools. So I'm kind of working in between the perspectives of the people, the Western perspective, and then my own knowledge of that I've accumulated in the psychedelic world. So it's been a challenge, and I've been doing my best to just try to help as many people, even just little by little. That's what Maestro Juan Flores says, little by little. And I feel like I've been doing it little by little, but it's not enough. It's getting worse. We just found a mass grave in BC. 215 children were found just dumped and it's from the 1960s. So this is not that far long ago. It's very contemporaneous, and to try to recover what was lost, because when the children were lost and the families and what they lost, it just, why would anybody care about medicine right now? Like there's like this separation, and I'm trying to bring it all together for us. And it's a challenge, but I think with all of our prayers and everything that we do, and especially with this talk, I think it's really important that we continue to try to institute our medicines. And so I'm a member of the Canadian Psychedelic Association, a board of director, and I'm just little by little, I'm just trying to get these perspectives out into the world and to try to integrate as much as I can to recover many of these traumas, because it's leading to this long-term illness in which I'm doing my best to help others to recover. So I know it's really heavy, everything that I said, but I just wanted to tell you what it's like on the ground, to try to integrate all of this. And then the pandemic itself has deeply hindered us for having any sense of connection at all. And the province that I'm in Ontario, on the very tip of Ontario. And we have some of the strictest lockdowns in the world. So lacking connection is really, it's a big challenge, but I hope this helps to educate and let everybody know what's going on, and help to get some support over time. I've developed a healing center that I will slowly be building on the land, and I hope to help more people in the future.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for sharing your powerful story and your powerful background. Yeah, absolutely fascinating and amazing, the good work that you're doing and that you're continuing to doing. And I think that really runs through all our panel, people who have been involved with their heart and are continuing to be involved against adversity in many cases. And I just think it's absolutely amazing. And as I know you do have to rush off to another meeting just now, I just wanted to ask you a quick question, and then obviously you're free to go. So really, how I think it's amazing how you started to integrate the kind of Peruvian learnings and how you brought it over, so to say. But I am curious, how did your communities in Canada react? Because it is very different, I presume. Or were there lots of similarities already?
There are some similarities, and there are some people that really integrated the methodologies into their lives. Many people have really integrated it, and it's been very heartwarming. But then there's the other side too, where since we were so deeply colonized, like through residential schools and through general perspectives of what people think the country believes, it's been very difficult that way too, because some indigenous folks will totally say no psychedelics, never, never, ever, and they would never even open their eyes to it. Meanwhile, we're in a state where it's absolutely necessary right now. It's so deeply necessary now, and I just hope that we can move forward in a really good way. But there is the dichotomy, the difference between the two. So there's some that are very, very open, and then some that are not open at all. So that's the challenge, really, is to bridge this work. And that's essentially all I do, is I bridge these two perspectives. And since the pandemic, I haven't been able to travel to many of the communities. So educating anyone has been quite difficult. It's been new. And Zoom has been excellent for many of these things, but we don't have the greatest internet connections either. So that's a challenge.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And do feel free to go if you have to go. Otherwise, please join. There's some more interesting questions coming up. I wanted to move back to Serena and Amanda as well. Just looking at loads of interesting questions for both of you. Sorry, quickly here. Amanda, what is your view on holotropic breathwork, and is it part of current or future research interest? I think that's actually something that also Maria mentioned from the earlier panel. But yes, please go ahead if you have any views on that, Amanda.
I know Stan, and I have great respect and liking for him, but I've never actually practiced myself. But I know that it has fantastic effects, people have told me. And yeah, but I'm too busy. I've got so many scientific programs on at the moment. It's not knocking at the door.
Absolutely. So we've spoken. I mean, I think that's something for also Serena. I mean, about all the progress that's going on in the US. I mean, how do you see the future of psychedelics in the US? What are your concerns, and what are your hopes?
Well, in California, I really do hope the bill will pass. I think last time I checked, I think the Senate voted for the decriminalization bill, but it still has to go through the legislative process, go to the governor's desk, get it signed, things like that. I think California provides a very interesting model for decriminalization because it allows gift sharing, meaning that you can consume psychedelics for yourself, but also if I was cultivating psilocybin, I can give that to some of my friends. It just discourages commercial activity. And again, my concern is like very similar to the cannabis sector. It's like there are still people in the underground, and I don't want legislators to play fiction and think that by decriminalizing it's going to be sufficient to help people come above ground. Because again, it's like what I've seen is that until we find a way to really regulate it, and I'm thinking about like the alcohol model as a model that we can use, like there are still a lot of risk for pushing people underground, and risk with respect to like what are they taking, dosing, things like that. And I just, slowly I just hope, kind of like with cannabis, that local jurisdictions at the city level, at the state level, will start shifting their policy based on scientific evidence, based on what is sound policy, what it is that is going to actually protect the consumers, and the people, really.
What about you, Yasmin? If you just have a minute, what are your kind of hopes really for your communities, or also taking a wider Canadian perspective, and what are your concerns in terms of development?
I hope that the minds and hearts in general would be able to accept many of these healings, because even accepting many of the methodologies are very difficult for some psychologically, because of legality, because of the perspectives of your city communities. It's very challenging, and many of these First Nation communities, because they're First Nations, because they're nations within nations, so they're the kings of where they are. They can determine anything that they want. So if you could have psychedelics legal in some of these communities, but they would never, because they've seen how many of the drug wars, the war on drugs has really put a damper on many people's minds. So even though we would be free to use many of these psychedelics, it's just not, it's not even heard of. It's not even heard of. So it's a big challenge to work through that for where I am.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the case here in the UK as well, with the scheduling of psychedelics, as Amanda, I'm sure, can testify, who's seen some changes, but not enough changes in terms of drug policy and scheduling.
There's a long way to go. And I'm horrified at how UK is really kind of in with North Korea or something. It's a slowness that reforming drug policy. But I hope dearly that the current government will make a move to reschedule definitely psilocybin, but psychedelics in general, because then that would make it much easier to carry out research, and also for doctors to prescribe. And generally, we should long ago have decriminalized psychoactive substances, as they have done in Portugal with enormous gain, and reschedule. And I very much beg those in charge to look at doing that soon.
I hope so. And I mean, we're drug science are also working towards it. I should just add. Oops. I just wanted to also ask Amanda, just last question really, because we are running out of time now. You outlined very briefly some of your exciting research that's coming up in terms of palliative care, for example. What are you most excited about, or what's really your hope in that regard in terms of research?
I'm actually very, very excited about palliative care, because I have observed how a microdose can completely transform a person who is suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's, and it will suddenly bring vitality and love back into their expression. And I think it is a really very, very exciting option, because our research in the dose testing study showed that 20 micrograms, which is a very small dose, but quite a big microdose, has this amazing effect of improving mood, vitality, pain management, and improving cognitive facilities such as attention. And those are all things that people need very much in old age to have improved. So I'm currently carrying out 2 researches, one in Jamaica with a community of terminally ill cancer patients, and another in the US, where at a clinic where they've got approval to do psilocybin-assisted therapy for dying. And I propose that we do use microdoses of LSD to prepare the people and to help integrate. And so we're setting up both of those researches currently. I find that very exciting. But I've got probably over 40 studies I'm doing at the moment around the world. So.
But thank you for the panelists for joining today, but also basically thank you for all the work you're putting in all your different ways, whether it's science, whether it's kind of the on the ground, whether it's law. I think it's the importance of collaboration and actually working together and working together efficiently is just key for all of us. So thank you.